Hi there, I'm Sophia.
And I'm Alexis.
Look outside. The temperature has increased, causing detrimental fires. Rising water levels which have caused millions of icebergs to break. More extreme weather events from flooding to droughts, the extinction of animals, and increased respiratory impacts as people's health continue to be affected.
Climate change. It has permanently altered the Earth's temperature to 1.1 degrees hotter. And this temperature continues to increase at an accelerated rate. The reality we live in is on your doorstep.
Climate change is an issue that humans began to notice in the late 19th century. At this time, scientists began to argue that our increase in greenhouse emissions are affecting the climate and the Earth's energy balance. The issue of climate change didn't become a widely known topic until 1998, when global warming and the depletion of the ozone layer was a topic of discussion in the media and of public debate. Today, 3.3 to 3.6 billion people are living in climate change hotspots. These regions generally deal with other issues like malnutrition, limited access to clean water, education, and health resources.
The effects of climate change aren't as evident in developed countries, while underdeveloped countries are already being negatively impacted. This is one of the reasons for an urgent need to solve climate change.
Many of the countries that are affected severely are from Africa, such as Ethiopia, where drought is affecting more than 24 million Ethiopians. This number is set to increase as the country enters its sixth consecutive failed rainy season.
Other affected countries are Nigeria, where flooding in late 2022 affected 2.5 million people, causing extensive damage to the country's farmland, as well as Chad, where Lake Chad has shrunk 90% in 60 years due to climate change. This is vital as Lake Chad covers 8% of the African continent and is home to 42 million people, whose livelihoods revolve around pastoralism, fishing, and farming.
While undeveloped countries suffer, developed countries contribute the most to the climate crisis. The UN is an intergovernmental organization where almost every country is a member. One of the leading member states tackling climate change within the UN is Sweden. They've implemented many strategies for lowering their greenhouse gas emissions and have adapted their nation in order to achieve these goals. A prominent activist from Sweden is Greta Thunberg, who famously started the trend of students striking from school to stop climate change. Although Germany has been a big contributor to the effects of climate change, they were the driving force for the Paris Agreement and have been committed to achieving their climate change goals.
The UN has implemented a program, UNEP, to tackle the effects of climate change. They are self-proclaimed leading advocates for tackling climate change. According to the UN's website, the UNEP stands at the core of the action in the fight against climate change. They have divided the task of tackling climate change into various fronts. They are encouraging the transition to low and zero carbon emissions in sectors such as agriculture, energy, building, forestry, industry, and transport. They are working with governments to improve air quality and reduce emissions of climate pollutants. They are also attempting to restore and protect natural ecosystems, especially ones that are vulnerable to the effects of climate change, such as forests and coral reefs. They have also stated that they are trying to empower communities to adapt to the effects of climate change by building resilient ecological foundations. The UN has been involved in the 2015 Paris Agreement, which implemented the goal of limiting global warming below 2 degrees Celsius.
Because the United Nations has so many members, inevitably, some countries have been reluctant to take action on climate change, and there have been slow progress in meeting these climate goals. The UN has been criticized for not doing enough to help undeveloped countries that do not have the same resources as others. They are considered the only intergovernmental organization that has enough power to bring all of the countries of the world together, and if they are effective in reaching their climate targets, they could make a huge change to the issue. The United Nations is aware of the damage we are doing to the climate, with Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General, stating that climate change is the defining issue of our time. It is not only an environmental challenge, but a social, economic, and security one as well. This portrays how the UN acknowledges that climate change affects the world on numerous fronts, and that nature and animals aren't the only ones who will suffer, but humans too.
The main obstacles that the UN faces are the political will of member states and the availability of financial resources. Some countries have been reluctant to act on climate change as they fear it will affect their economy, or they don't believe it is a serious threat. The United Nations is also an obvious example of an IGO that has a cosmopolitan approach. as they represent every country in the world, and their main objective is for each country to have a stable climate.
Europe is the fourth biggest contributor to global greenhouse gas emissions. The EU, which has 27 member states, has produced 17% of the world's carbon dioxide emissions since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Germany has the highest rate of emissions out of all European states, accounting for a quarter of the EU's total emissions. Germany's high rates are due to fossil fuel combustion for energy use. A few countries in Europe, such as Spain and Denmark, have planned to ban all fossil fuel developments by 2040 to 2050 and create lower rates of greenhouse gas emissions than countries like Germany, whose fossil fuel developments aren't declining. Italy and Poland both produce 12.4% of Europe's greenhouse gas emissions.
The European Union is an idea and is a key global actor in the Northern Hemisphere. The Union has adopted the European Climate Law. The law is a legal objective for the Union to reach the climate target 55% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030. By 2050, they also want to reach climate neutrality. Germany is aware of the high usage of coal and is considering implementing a goal to phase out fossil fuel development and will soon start to put their faith in renewable energy. Germany has also implemented annual reduction targets for individual sectors until 2030. These sectors include agriculture, transport, and energy. The President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, stated that climate change is a threat to our planet, our people, and our prosperity. We must act now to reduce emissions and build a sustainable future.
Europe implemented climate policies that in theory would make the Union surpass the emission targets before the deadline. However, the policies have not been followed effectively, and the overall climate action has been deemed inefficient by the SAC. On a positive note, the EU has been considered the leading IGO in the fight against climate change. The EU adopted multiple targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and although they have been considered ambitious, they are on the right track to meet these goals. The EU made a commitment to help undeveloped countries address climate change. They are providing these countries with financial aid to invest in renewable energy and help restore their damaged ecosystems and civilizations. The EU has been faced with challenges when trying to tackle climate change. Some members of the Union are pressuring them to roll back their commitments to the issue due to their struggle to adapt to these changes. However, the EU remains committed to its climate goals and will likely remain the leading contributor to the fight against climate change. In general, the European Union has a cosmopolitan approach to the issue as they are aiding other undeveloped countries and a focus on healing the world's climate as a whole. The African Union. Africa's climate has warmed significantly since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Along with this, the sea levels along the coast of Africa are rising, which increases the chance of coastal flooding and erosion. Despite these risks, Africa is the least responsible for the global climate crisis, as generally countries in the continent are less industrially advanced as other big states. Africa accounts for 15% of the world population, but accumulates just 4% of CO2 emissions. The biggest impact that climate change will have on Africa is on their economy. According to a study by Christian Aid, it is estimated that Africa's GDP growth rates fall up to 64% by the end of the century. The burning of fossil fuels at the current rate will cause African countries' finances to suffer. This is because fossil fuels cause air pollution that costs millions to undo. Air pollution accounts for a global economic loss of $2.9 trillion annually.
Recently, the Union has made a public strategy in order to combat the global issue of climate change. They aim to develop a resource-efficient industry that involves multiple sectors such as agriculture systems, water resources, energy, infrastructure, and transport. They aim for all these sectors to be more climate resilient. This plan was led by Egypt. In 2022, they implemented the African Union Climate Change and Resilient Development Strategy and Action Plan. This plan lays out the foundation for climate improvement. According to the plan, the African Union aims to create a sustainable, prosperous, equitable, and climate-resilient Africa. They also hope to repair the damage made to African communities, ecosystems, and economies. In 2021, the AU also implemented the African Green Deal, which is considered ambitious. but is achievable with the right amount of commitment and investment. In conclusion, the Union's main objective is to reduce its greenhouse emissions and build climate resilience. Paul Kagame, the president of Rwanda, responded to the issue saying, "Climate change is a threat to our planet, but there's also an opportunity for Africa. We can use climate change as a catalyst for green growth and development."
The African Union's climate change plan is a positive step in the right direction as it brings the continent together to combat the issue. The plan has also given the Union more global recognition and will bring in partnerships and support from other states/IGOs. It was stated by the EU that bigger industrial countries should do more to tackle the global climate crisis as Africa suffers the most consequences. This shows Africa has gained sympathy and support from other unions and countries. The EU also recognised that prohibiting all use of fossil fuels in Africa is unsustainable due to their special circumstances. This understanding from the EU has established an EU/Africa climate cooperation. This shows that the African Union is on the right path to developing stronger ties with other global actors and bringing more hope to their nation in dealing with the climate crisis.
One of the main reasons the African Union hasn't been able to effectively reach its goals is due to the lack of resources. Africa is a continent that is generally poverty-stricken and disadvantaged, and these disadvantages have consequences on all fronts, including attempting to combat climate change. Another issue is the AU's member states' willingness to adapt to climate change and implement policies. The African Union has been criticized in the past for not being ambitious enough with its climate goals, but the 2021 African Green Deal is an ambitious and positive step towards transforming Africa into a climate-thriving continent. Now we head over to our news anchor in India, Sam.
India accounts for 4.8% of the world's carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide emissions. Needless to say, they play a crucial role in reversing climate change. Reasons include India's massive reliance on coal as the government pushes for increased domestic coal production and plans to build substantial new coal power capacities between 2027 and 2032. 75% of India's population uses coal as their primary source of electricity. And India's 221 gigawatts of operating coal plants, making it the world's third largest fleet. This coal use is resulting in the deaths of 1 in every 8 people dying from pollution. And India houses half of the most polluted cities in the world. But India's Prime Minister claims that climate change is not of our making. Modi said at the United Nations 2015 climate change talk in Paris. The government wishes to combat this, starting with the hope to end imports from Indonesia, South Africa, and Australia. Modi states, "Climate change is a serious threat to our planet and our people. We need to take urgent action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and adapt to the impacts of climate change." As India has also pledged to invest $100 billion in clean energy over the next 5 years, and to source 40% of the country's electricity from renewable and low-carbon sources by 2030. Despite India being both a country that greatly contributes to climate change, that is also highly affected by climate change, in 2017 they made successful investments in renewable energy. However, only 15.5% of India's electricity came from renewables in 2017, including 9.1% from large hydro. Although India still perseveres to have renewable energy, renewables in India have increased from almost $431 million in the 2014 financial year to a whopping $1.4 billion in 2016, to being $197 billion today, as India invests in installing 500 gigawatts of renewable energy capacity in an attempt to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2070. India struggles to act on their plans as their population is one of the biggest in the world. And as Modi isn't proactive in his plans, stating moving away from coal has proven to be difficult. Modi makes lots of pledges, but fails to act on them. But India has grown its renewable energy, now accounting for 17% of its electricity generation. India's emissions have decreased about 20% since 2005. However, India's overall emissions have continued to grow due to its rapid economic and population growth. India has a target of bringing 33% of its land area under forest cover. However, forest cover has been declining in recent years due to deforestation. Lots of confusion arises with the solutions for climate change, as there is no simple solution, and because of this, it can cause confusion and lack of action. as well as the actions of non-state actors such as transnational corporations, play a significant role in climate change, like Reliance Industries, the largest private sector company in India, and one of the largest emitters of greenhouse gases in the country, a company which harvests oil, gas, and petrochemicals from India.
The United States is the world's second largest greenhouse gas emitter, as well as the leading producer of oil. In 2020, U.S. greenhouse gas emissions totaled 5,981 million metric tons. Although this was a 20% decrease since 2005, the United States still continues to be one of the world's leading countries in carbon emissions. 31% of total greenhouse gas emissions stem from the power plants, as well as the additional 10% stemming from agriculture and deforestation. The US has lost over 50% of its forests since the European settlers came. The production of cement and steel among their industries also produced 7% of the US's carbon emissions.
In 2021, the Biden administration rejoined the Paris Agreement, pledging to reduce the United Nations greenhouse gas emissions by 52% below 2005, in which the USA released 378.9 parts per million. They plan to reach this level by 2030. The USA has also invested in clean energy sources such as solar and wind power. They are also in the process of developing new technologies to generate power. Although the USA has acknowledged climate change and has made some positive changes in order to tackle the issue, they are the second biggest emitter of greenhouse gases and are not doing enough to reduce these emissions. Since Biden's presidency, the United States has moved forward in addressing climate change, but previously the country had some major setbacks when the Trump administration rolled back multiple regulations in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. In the past, the US has not provided any financial aid to undeveloped countries affected by climate change, which proves that the country doesn't generally have a cosmopolitan approach and is focusing on its own nation. However, recently, President Joe Biden issued a statement saying, "The United States is back at the table, and we are committed to working with other countries to address climate change." The US has the potential to make a positive impact on the global climate issue as long as they maintain environmental protocols.
Shell, the largest oil giant in the world, has made no efforts to change its unsustainable ways and only attributes 1% of its long-term investments to low-carbon energy alternatives. Shell is estimated to account for close to 1.6% of the global 1.5-degree carbon budget. Out of the 58 million tons of carbon dioxide that is released by Shell into the atmosphere in 2022, they make one of the biggest carbon footprints in the world. Shell's oil production declines 1 to 2% every year, but they plan to grow their fossil fuel business by 20% in the upcoming years.
Shell has pledged to net zero carbon emissions by 2050, but through this they have exploited gaps in the pledge to increase their fossil fuel sales. Shell's net zero target also is limited to energy products, entirely excluding its petrochemical business, which supplies 17 million tons of chemicals per year. To absorb the amount of carbon emissions they have produced, they plan on planting trees in areas as big as Brazil, but many people criticize this, saying the approach is delusional, and that planting that many trees at once in a concentrated area could also have downsides. Shell also promised to spend $100 million a year on its carbon emissions, offsetting emissions of around 120 million tons a year by 2030, but they failed to meet this promise as they spent $1.7 billion on their integrated gas business, intending to search for new fossil fuels, and only $70 million on capturing emissions. Studies show that Shell fell short of its own 2020 goal to invest $6 billion in renewable energy while continuing to make significant investments in fossil fuels.
Even though the company has made some headway in lowering its emissions, it still produces a significant amount of greenhouse gases compared to its investments in fossil fuels. Shell's investments in renewable energy are relatively small. However, Shell is developing carbon capture and storage technologies that are still in early phases of development.
Shell states, "If society changes its energy demands more quickly, we intend to aid that acceleration. If it changes more slowly, we will not be able to move as quickly." They only plan to base their trajectories on society's interests instead of the world's interests, and this has an impact on climate change. Shell is responsible for causing long-term changes, like the reduced lifespans of people living in oil spill-affected areas, particularly in Nigeria, by up to 10 years. These spills have caused sickness that has killed over 16,000 children, mostly those who live in areas where the water is contaminated with oil. Not to mention the tragic deaths of those who have fallen into the oil. Oil irreversibly destroys agricultural land, and anyone who tries to speak out risks being sentenced for false charges and losing everything they own. Shell employees are driven to sabotage oil plants in order to support their families because Shell won't look into oil leaks. As a result of these long-term environmental effects, 26 million more Nigerians perish, and many more lose their money due to a lack of land for farming and water for fishing. Since the standard of living and support in Nigeria is so low, people will do anything for the money that Shell gives them. This includes corrupt village chiefs, the government, and the police, who will prosecute anyone who raises the issue of Shell killing hundreds of peaceful protesters.